The air inside the courtroom was so still it felt like every breath might shatter it. Rows of wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of people leaning forward, their eyes locked on the man standing at the center of it all. His name was Marcus Holloway, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his early 40s, dressed not in the crisp suit of an attorney or the tailored uniform of a public servant, but in the plain, well-worn jacket of a man who had lived through storms. His face bore lines that spoke not of age but of struggle, of a life spent pushing back against walls built to keep him out. Before him loomed a judge known for severity. Judge Theodore McConnell, a man whose reputation stretched beyond this courthouse, was infamous for rulings that carried weight not just in dollars and years, but in lives broken, futures dismantled. Today, he sat high above the room in his black robe, eyes narrowed as if the very presence of Marcus was an affront. The gavel had barely fallen when the verdict was read. Marcus, accused of defrauding a corporation that had once exploited his community, stood accused of a crime that many in the room suspected wasn't his alone to bear. But the words that followed came like thunder. "Mr. Holloway," Judge McConnell's voice boomed, "this court finds you liable. You are hereby fined in the amount of $500 million. The gasp that erupted from the courtroom felt almost physical, like a wave rolling through every person seated there. $500 million. A number so staggering it seemed plucked from fiction. Mothers clutched their children's hands tighter. Young men shook their heads in disbelief, and reporters scrambled to put the figure into their notes as if they might have misheard. Marcus did not flinch. He stood tall, his eyes steady, his back unbowed. There was silence again, the kind of silence that comes before an earthquake, when the ground itself seems to hold its breath. Everyone expected outrage, denial, or even desperation. A man crushed under the weight of such a ruling might plead, cry, or collapse. But Marcus did none of those things. Instead, he drew in a deep breath, let it out slowly, and spoke in a voice that carried across the room with a calm, commanding strength. "Your Honor," he said, his tone neither submissive nor defiant but something far more dangerous, steady truth. "You can fine me $500 million or $5 billion or $5 trillion. It does not matter, because what you cannot take from me is the truth of what brought me here. You cannot silence the voice of a people who have been robbed, generation after generation, by the very institutions you protect." The judge's face hardened, his gavel striking wood. "You will address this court with respect." "I am addressing this court with respect," Marcus replied, his eyes fixed on the man above him. "But respect does not mean silence. Respect does not mean bowing my head while injustice is carried out. Respect is standing here, looking you in the eye, and telling you that your fine cannot erase what has been done to my people. You call me a criminal for standing against a corporation that poisoned our water, stripped our land, and paid off politicians to look the other way. But I am not the criminal in this room." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even the reporters, pens frozen mid-air, seemed unable to look away. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. $500 million is a number meant to break me, to make an example of me so others won't dare to stand up. But you cannot bankrupt dignity. You cannot bankrupt truth. You cannot bankrupt a man who has already watched his community pay with their lives, their health, their futures. The judge leaned forward, his lips pressed thin, but Marcus pressed on, his voice now a drumbeat that echoed through every heart in the room. "When my grandmother told me stories about walking miles just to cast her vote in a system designed to shut her out, she told me never to be afraid. When my father worked 3 jobs and still came home with calloused hands and an empty wallet, he told me never to forget my worth. And when I buried my best friend because the very company you now protect dumped waste into our river, poisoning his lungs until he could no longer breathe, I swore I would never stop fighting." The silence in the courtroom had transformed. It was no longer heavy with disbelief but charged with something else, something alive. Hope, pride, A fierce recognition that Marcus was not just speaking for himself but for everyone who had ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to take what was given. He turned then, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, locking onto faces filled with tears, with anger, with unshakable solidarity. So find me, Judge McConnell. Take your $500 million that I don't have and I never will. But understand this, the debt owed is not mine. It is yours. It is this nation's. It is the debt of centuries of stolen labor, stolen land, stolen lives. And no courtroom, no judge, no fine can hide from that truth forever. The judge slammed his gavel again. His voice raised, but the power had shifted. It was no longer McConnell's courtroom, it was Marcus's. His words hung in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate, clinging to every soul present. Reporters rushed to capture every syllable. Some jurors wiped at their eyes. Even the bailiffs, trained to stand like statues, shifted uneasily. What Marcus had said could not be unheard. And then, in the stillness that followed, something remarkable happened. A young black man seated in the back of the courtroom stood to his feet. His voice was quiet at first, but steady. "He's right." Another stood, then another, and soon, an entire section of the courtroom rose in unison. Their voices carried, not in shouts but in a low, unified murmur of agreement, a chorus that grew louder until it filled the chamber like a storm breaking free. Marcus did not smile, but his eyes shone with a fire that no fine could extinguish. He had not just responded to the judge's ruling. He had redefined it. What was meant to be his downfall had become his platform, and what was meant to silence him had instead unleashed a voice that belonged not to one man, but to a people. And though the gavel struck again and again, demanding order, demanding silence, demanding submission, the truth had already been spoken, and it would not be forgotten. The days that followed were unlike anything the courthouse, or the city itself, had ever seen. News outlets replayed Marcus Holloway's words on a loop, his face filling television screens and mobile phones across the nation. Clips of him standing firm in the face of a $500 million fine spread like wildfire. Some called him reckless. Others called him a hero. But one thing was certain. No one could ignore him. Outside the courthouse the next morning, a crowd had already begun to form. They carried signs, not of anger alone, but of defiance and unity. You cannot bankrupt dignity. Truth cannot be fined. We are Marcus. The chants grew louder as cameras captured the moment, a movement rising from a single man's words. Inside his modest home, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, his head bowed not in defeat but in contemplation. His mother, an elderly woman whose quiet strength had carried him through every storm, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You spoke the truth," she whispered, "and truth, my son, is heavier than gold. But remember, they will come after you harder now." Marcus lifted his eyes to her, the same fire still burning. "Let them," he said. "If they think 500 million can scare me into silence, they've already lost. Because this isn't about me anymore. It never was. It's about us, all of us." And indeed, the movement grew. Churches held vigils, students walked out of classrooms, and community leaders called for accountability from the very corporation Marcus had exposed. Stories began to surface. Families with children suffering strange illnesses, neighborhoods with poisoned water, communities forgotten and discarded in the name of profit. Marcus's words had unlocked something buried deep, a collective memory of injustice that could no longer be ignored. But with the rising tide of support came the backlash. Judge McConnell appeared on television, insisting his ruling was lawful, that Marcus's case was clear-cut. Commentators debated endlessly, some painting Marcus as a radical agitator trying to topple the system. Yet even in their attempts to discredit him, his name was on their lips, his words seeping into the national consciousness. One evening, as Marcus walked into a town hall packed with supporters, the room erupted in applause. People from every walk of life, black, white, young, old, had come to hear him. He stood before them, the weight of the fine hanging in the air like a shadow, and raised his voice once more. They thought this number, this $500 million, would silence me, but instead it amplified me. They thought this courtroom would bury me, but instead it became a stage. They thought this fight was mine alone. But look at us, we are many. And we are unstoppable. The room thundered with cheers. Marcus continued, his voice steady, almost prophetic. This is bigger than a fine. Bigger than one case. This is about centuries of being told we do not matter, centuries of being treated like we are less. And now they've put a price tag on our dignity. $500 million. But I tell you today, dignity is not for sale. Justice is not for sale. Truth is not for sale. Reporters captured every word. Within hours, the speech was trending worldwide. Young people began painting murals of Marcus, depicting him not as a victim but as a symbol of resistance. His face appeared on banners at protests, on t-shirts, even on walls in neighborhoods thousands of miles away. He had become more than a man, he had become a movement. Yet Marcus never allowed himself to be carried away by the praise. In quiet moments, he still thought of the people whose lives had been stolen. The sick children, the buried friends, the families forced to leave their homes because their water was no longer safe. It was their faces that kept him grounded, their memories that kept him speaking. Then came the moment no one expected. A group of prominent civil rights attorneys, moved by Marcus's stand, filed a massive countersuit against the corporation he had exposed. They demanded reparations for the community, citing decades of environmental damage and corruption. The irony was not lost on anyone. While Marcus had been fined $500 million, now the corporation faced the possibility of paying billions. The courtroom that once sentenced Marcus became the battleground for a greater trial, one that carried the weight of history itself. People camped outside, waiting for updates, their signs and voices echoing through the streets. And when Marcus walked through those courthouse doors once more, he did not walk alone. He was flanked by mothers, fathers, children, pastors, workers, and neighbors. An army of voices that refused to be silenced. Inside, the corporation's attorneys spoke of legality, contracts, and technicalities. But Marcus's attorneys spoke of people, of lives ruined, of families left behind, of dignity stripped and futures stolen. And through it all, Marcus sat with the same unshakable calm he had shown on the day of his own verdict, as though he knew that no matter the outcome, the tide had already turned. Weeks passed. The trial stretched on. But outside, the movement grew unstoppable. Cities across the country lit up with protests, vigils, and marches. And for the first time in a long time, the conversation shifted, not about whether Marcus was guilty, but about whether the system itself had finally been exposed for what it was. Finally, the day of the ruling arrived. The courtroom was packed to the brim, cameras lining every corner. Judge McConnell himself presided again, though his face carried the weight of weeks of scrutiny and pressure. He cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and read aloud the decision. The corporation is hereby ordered to pay damages in the amount of $3 billion to the affected communities. The room erupted. Cheers, tears, embraces. It was as though the walls themselves shook with the sound of justice long delayed but finally spoken. For once, the gavel did not silence the people. For once, the fine was not against the oppressed but against the oppressor. Marcus rose slowly to his feet. He did not smile, did not gloat. Instead, he placed his hand over his heart and whispered a single word that only those nearest to him heard. Finally, as he walked out of the courthouse, the crowd outside surged forward, chanting his name, lifting signs high into the air. The man who had been fined $500 million, who was meant to be crushed by the weight of injustice, had instead carried it on his shoulders and turned it into a torch for others to see. That night, Marcus sat once again at his kitchen table, his mother across from him. She reached for his hand, her eyes glistening with quiet pride. "You did more than fight for yourself," she said softly. "You fought for all of us." Marcus nodded, his gaze distant but resolute. "This isn't the end," he replied. "It's only the beginning. They tried to put a price on us. But what they don't understand is we are priceless." And with those words, the story of Marcus Holloway became more than a courtroom drama. It became a living testament to courage, to dignity, to the unbreakable truth that no fine, no sentence, no system of oppression can contain the power of a people who refuse to be silenced. The fine was meant to be his downfall. Instead, it became his uprising. And in the echo of his voice, in the murals painted on city walls, in the chants of protesters and the whispers of grandmothers to their grandchildren, one truth remained. Justice can be delayed, but it cannot be denied.